Hello and welcome to Skills and Automation. My name is Ash and today we are going to build an end-to-end project designed to address a real-life business problem. That is, how to send information out to team members and how to collect back their responses and reconcile it with our original data. Okay, imagine that we're in the accounting department and there are a lot of overdue invoices. And our biggest question is, are we going to get this money back or do we need to write off these invoices? So, to find out, we will split our master data set of overdue invoices into separate individual reports for each account, email the offsite sales team members the reports that are related to their account. They will need to confirm the statuses of those invoices within that report, send the file back to us, and we will need to compile all the return files and reconcile all the responses within them back to our original data set. This is a big workflow and we are going to automate the whole thing. Trying to achieve this flow manually is a nightmare, and MS Forms and MS Teams are just not dynamic enough to handle the level of customizations that we require. So it's VBA to the rescue as usual. And if this is something that sounds interesting to you, do stick around. This is going to be a long but satisfying video with a lot of useful code. Let's first have a look at what we will be building. This is a dataset of partially paid and unpaid invoices. The name of the salesperson is in column F. A macro will be split in two parts. Outbound, where we send out reports to the salesperson, and inbound, where we compile and reconcile the responses. We can see multiple entries out here per salesperson. So for the outbound, first we need to split this report by the name of the salesperson, and then we will need to send the report out to each salesperson. The email addresses are in the email worksheet here, but there are two challenges. First is that we want to force the salesperson to provide us back a standard response. So we'll add a drop-down list against each invoice in column G. The values in the drop-down list are given here in the worksheet name list. We will also let the salespersons type their remarks in column H. This is a sample file that has been filled out by the salesperson Samir. We have the drop-down list in column G. So what is the rationale for this drop-down list? Imagine we need to review 1000 plus invoices. Then it makes sense to group the responses into separate categories so that they are more manageable and we can report on them easily. And the second challenge is that we don't want the salesperson tampering with this main data. We don't want them deleting a row, hiding any column, or changing any data, because if they do, then our inbound macro will not be able to read their responses. So a solution will be to lock every cell in the sheet except the cells in column G and H, since we do need them to note down the responses. So as you can see out here, these are locked, but the cells in column G and H are still editable. Okay, that's the first part of the macro. Let's go to the VBA editor and run this first macro. And let's go to Outlook, come to our sent folder. We can see 3 emails have been sent out. Let's open one attachment. This report only has invoices related to this salesperson. All fields are locked except the fields in column G and H. Column G has a drop down, and in column H, we can enter in some free text. So that's part 1 complete. For the second part, we need to compile all the responses and add them back to the main data set in column G and H. So now I'm going to play the part of each salesperson. I've filled out the 3 files and emailed it back to my account. For this macro, it doesn't matter who sent the file back. Our key identifier is the file name. In the real world, the key identifier should be the email ID. Now, I've said this in all my previous Outlook videos. I don't really like reading emails directly by connecting to Outlook. It's too easy to mess up the code and really not worth the risk. What we will do is copy the emails and paste them in a local folder. Let's copy and paste it onto our folder. We will design a macro to read these safe messages. This is a very safe way to read Outlook messages and I highly recommend it for a business environment. However, you can read directly from an Outlook folder as well. I have a video which shows both methods. Anyways, our second macro will loop through all these saved emails extract the attachments, copy the data from each file and paste it into the original file but in a separate worksheet. And finally, it will reconcile back the responses back to our main data set. This is all one automated step. Let's run this macro. The responses that we got back in our email are now populated against each invoice. This folder has the original emails, and this folder has the extracted messages. Performing individual tasks in VBA is relatively straightforward. You can pretty much start building right away. A multi-step solution, however, requires a bit of planning, and that's what we're going to do in this section. Each step that you're about to see now will land up being an individual macro that we will code out shortly. Our basic build logic is as follows. We will build two main or parent macros, one for the outbound flow and one for the inbound flow. We will also build separate macros to perform subtasks, and we'll call these submacros from our parent macro. This is intended to make our code more manageable. Let's look at the first flow. The objective of the outbound macro is to send an Excel report file with comments column to each salesperson. So in step 1, we will create a unique list of salespersons from the main data set. In step 2, we will gather a list of fixed comments for our drop-down list. Next, we'll create a loop in VBA that will iterate over each salesperson that we have identified from a unique list from step 1. Step 3, we will separate out the data for each salesperson. Step 4, we will create a separate file based on the data that we have just isolated. Step 5, we will email this file to the respective salesperson. Okay, next is the inbound macro. Our objective is to now reconcile each returned Excel report file with the original data set. As a manual step, we would have copied and saved the Outlook emails onto our computer. We are now ready to start the inbound macro. Step 1, we will extract the attachments from the email from each salesperson. Step 2, we will grab the data from each report and compile it all together into a single Excel spreadsheet. Step 3, we will reconcile back each compiled response back with the original data set. And this completes our two-step automation flow. Next, let's cover off a few additional points of discussion before we start coding. I need to mention one obvious alternative to this VBA macro. You could always just share the full master data set on MS Teams and then ask the salespersons to go in and confirm the statuses under their account. So the use case for this VBA macro flow that we are building is audit and confidentiality. We don't want the salespersons to see each other's information, and the best way around this would be to simply email the salespersons the information that is related to them. And that's exactly what we will be building today. Besides, processes such as write-offs and even stock takes require an audit trail, and emails are a great way to prove receipt and confirmation to auditors. Similar to all my previous projects, we are going to build this one from scratch. I will talk through what I'm doing as I build the code, but I'm not going to spend much time explaining any concept. I have made separate videos that deep dive into certain important concepts and techniques that we cover in today's project. Links will be in the description below. Okay, only one thing left to do now. Let's start coding. First up, we will build the parent macro for our outbound flow. So we are currently in a macro file. We have our main data set in worksheet data. The worksheet response is blank. The worksheet list has a list of our fixed comments. The worksheet email has a list of emails for each salesperson. And we have a workings worksheet, which is blank as well. Let's go to the VBA editor, Alt F11. We'll be referring to our worksheets directly using their worksheet code name. Let's create our first module. And let's create the parent outbound macro. The objective of our parent macro is to control the flow of code from one location. It will contain some basic setup and even the main for loop, but most of our logic will be coded in separate sub-procedures or child macros, which we will call from the parent macro. So let's create the parent sub. Let's add the code to stop the screen from fluttering and stop Excel alerts. Let's have a look at the dataset for a sec. First, we need to find the unique list of salespersons from column F And using that list, we will isolate the data related to each of those salespersons. We will achieve this using advanced filter. And to do any operation using advanced filter, we need to provide the headers of the data that we are about to output. We will do this on a separate worksheet called workings. So first, let's blank this worksheet out. Next, let's add our headers. Column A in the workings worksheet will contain our unique list of salespersons. So we need to add a header, which is nothing but the header of column F, that is salesperson. Let's just copy this, go back to our code. Based on this unique list, we will filter and copy the data from the data sheet related to each salesperson back into the workings worksheet. So we'll paste our data into cell C1 and we need to provide the headers for this copy to range. And the headers are just basically the same headers of the main data set. So that's what we will copy over. So we want to take the first row of the main data set, which is basically the first row of the current region. And paste it in cell C1. And we're going to copy the data for each salesperson, which is basically a filter or a criteria. And we need to provide this criteria range in column K on the workings worksheet. So once again, we need to provide the header, which is basically salesperson. I just realized that this should be data worksheet. So we're copying the headers from the data worksheet and placing it into the workings worksheet. All right, back to what we were doing. Well, we're basically doing the same thing as here. So let's just copy that. But this time we're adding the header into cell K1. Okay, so that's our basic setup. I'm just going to play this macro once to just show you what the headers on the workings worksheet is going to look like. So this is the header for the unique list. This is the header for the copy to range. And this is the header for the criteria range when we are about to do a copy action. We are now ready to extract a unique list of salespersons. Let's do that in the next module. We will now begin building our child macros. First, we will find the unique list of salespersons. In the data sheet, we can see that the salesperson's name repeats in column F. We will now find the unique list of these salesperson names. We will then create separate reports with invoices related to each name. Okay, back to our parent macro. We will create the logic for the unique list in a separate macro. Let's create a new module and a new sub. We will use the advanced filter technique here. For that, we need to identify the data range, which is the data sheet. So we'll set our range list variable as the current region of data in the data sheet. Then we need to identify the copy to range where we'll output the unique list of salesperson, which is just the header that we had created earlier in cell A1 in the workings worksheet. So let's add that range as well. And we are now ready to use the advanced filter method. So we'll filter on the main data range. So the action is copy. There is no criteria range. The copy to range will be this. And unique by default is false. So in this case, we need to set it to true. Let's align this. Okay, that's it. Let's call this sub from the parent macro. We don't need to explicitly say call, but I just like to use it. It just tells us that we are calling a sub. Okay, let's test this out and see if it works. Hit the play button, go back to our workings worksheet, and we have a unique list of salespersons in column A. Moving on. Now, we'll build a child sub to load up a string variable which will contain all the list of comments that we are going to use to create the drop-down menu. Let's have a look at the list worksheet where all the comments are stored. We are simply going to loop over this list and populate a string variable which holds each value separated by a comma. Back to our code. Let's create a new module and a new sub. Well, not a sub. This time we need to return back the full comment string. So we'll create a function. And we're returning back a string. To loop over the data, we need to find the last row. And the last row will just be the count of the rows in the current region. Let's create a string variable to hold all the comments and an iteration variable. Let's create the for loop. The loop starts from the first row to the last row, which is the last row variable. In each iteration of the loop, we will concat the previous value of the string variable to the current value of that cell in column A, separated by a comma. So the previous value of the string list variable separated by a comma and concatenated to the current value of the cell in column A. This will create a single string variable holding all the comments. Only thing is that the string will have a comma at the start because the starting value of the string variable was blank. So let's remove that first comma. We need to do this outside the loop. So we're taking everything to the right of the string list variable except the very first value, which is the length of the variable minus 1. And finally, let's return this value back to the function. Okay, the function is ready. Let's call it from the parent sub. We are back in our parent sub. We are going to load the value returned by the function into a string variable, which will represent the comments. That's it. Let's test it out by doing a debug.print. Open the imaged window, play the sub, and we can see a full list separated by a comma, and there is no starting comma either. Great. Next, let's begin the for loop. It's now time to loop over the unique list of salespersons that we had determined in step 1. We are now inside the parent outbound macro. To loop over our unique list, we need to determine the last row. We'll need an iteration variable for the loop. Let's create some variables to hold the salesperson name, the file name, and the email ID. And let's create the loop. We can ignore the header row and start from the second row. First, we need to capture the salesperson name from the current cell in column A. Next, we need to capture the file name for the report that we are about to save. The file will be named after the salesperson, but we will need to store the full file path in this file name variable. So this includes the folder where each file is going to be saved. We will store the folder path as a public constant in a separate module. This will make it easier for us to identify it in case later on we want to change the folder paths for any reason. Create a new module. Let's create the public const. Paste the folder path. Don't forget the backslash. And let's go back to our parent sub. This file name will be a concat of the output folder. That's the folder path. And the actual file name, which is just the name of the salesperson. So that's our basic structure for the for loop. In the next module, we will separate out the data for each salesperson. In this module, we'll use the advanced filter technique to filter and copy data related to each salesperson onto a separate workings worksheet. So let's create a new module and a new sub. This child macro will run for each salesperson based on the for loop in the parent macro. Let's come to our parent macro. We're going to need to pass in the salesperson name into each call to isolate our data. So we are going to paste in our data from column C through to column K. Column C to H is our copy to range and column K is a criteria range. Let's clear out all the data from the second row onwards in this area. we need to filter the data before we copy. Hence, we'll need to enter the filter or criteria value, which is the salesperson, below the header in column K. So the salesperson name will be the value of the salesperson variable that we are passing through our sub. Okay, let's create all the range variables for our advanced filter method. We have the data range, the criteria range, and the copy to range. And now let's assign values to each range variable. This is our main data set. The criteria range will be the current region of cell K1 in the workings worksheet. So we need the header and the value below it. And the copy to range is just this top row, which starts from cell C1 in the workings worksheet. Okay, let's build our advanced filter method. We want to copy, supply the criteria range, the copy to range, and unique by default is false. And we need to call a child sub from the parent macro. So let's return to the for loop. So just to be clear, we're calling our child macro to isolate the data, and we're passing the salesperson that we have already determined up here. Okay, let's test this out. Put a code break before we start our next iteration. Run the sub. Go to the workings worksheet. Great. John is our first salesperson, and we have copied and pasted out the data related to this salesperson. In the next module, we'll create a file from this data. Now, let's create a file for each salesperson. This is where we do the heavy lifting for the first outbound macro. We are still in the parent for loop, and we have already isolated the data for the salesperson onto a workings worksheet. In this module, we will copy this data into a new Excel workbook, add a comments dropdown in column G, allow for a freestyle remark column in column H, and lock the rest of the cells. And finally, we'll save the file onto our computer. Let's get started. Let's create a new module. And just on a side note, I'm naming all the modules in a way that makes it organized in the project window. Let's create a new sub. This sub will take 3 parameters. First, the salesperson and the file name that we had identified in the for loop. So it's these two out here. And for the third parameter, we'll also pass in the comment string that we had created outside the for loop. So the salesperson as string, file name as string, and comments as string as well. We need to open a new blank Excel workbook to save our data. And let's assign a worksheet variable to represent the first worksheet in that workbook. And now we are going to do a simple copy and paste from the data in columns C through to H. And let's autofit the columns in the new worksheet. So this will paste in data in the new worksheet from columns A through to column F. Next, we need to add the comments drop down in the next column, which is column G, against our pasted data. Let's first grab the last row of our data and add the column headers. The drop down column header will be called action. And the freestyle comments column header will be called remarks. Now, let's explicitly ensure that the data in these column ranges are always accessible or unlocked. So the locked property of the data range in our comments column needs to be set to false. And now we can add in the comments into the cells in column G. This is the same as going through the data validation and choosing a list in the Excel UI menu. So we can add our list to all the cells in column G in one go. So we're adding a list. Let's choose that. Let's move the code to a new line. We'll choose an alert style as well. So this option will just give us an alert if the user tries to enter a value not from the list. And the comments will go into the Formula 1 option. That's it. We will allow the user to filter the data even though they cannot modify it. And now that we have prepared the worksheet, let's lock it up. Let's give a password and allow the user to filter data. Okay, so now we have locked all the cells except the ones that we had explicitly stated as locked false. Let's save this workbook. We'll save it as the file name. I just realized that we don't really need to pass in the salesperson name. That's one less parameter. Okay, so where were we? We are saving our workbook. We are passing the file name, and a file format will be the XLSX format, which is this option. And let's close the workbook. And that's done. Let's go back to the main macro and call our sub from here. All right, let's test it out. Let's put a code break at the next iteration. So we're expecting a file to be created for the first salesperson and placed into our folder here. Let's run the macro. So this needs to be rows.count. Right, let's run the test again. Go to our folder and we can see our first file. Let's open it. Increase the size. So we have our auto filters on top. Let's click where the cells are locked. Let's come into column G. We can see our drop down here and we can obviously fill in a value because this area is unlocked, and we can type in some free text in column H. Okay, looks good so far. Let's move on and send these files out by email. So far, we have created individual files for each salesperson. Now we are ready to email them out. But for that, we will first need to grab the email ID for each salesperson. Let's do that in this section. So the list of emails is in this email worksheet. We are going to do a simple lookup against the salesperson name in column A. And if a match is found, we'll grab the email ID from the adjacent cell. Let's build a function for this. New module. Create a new function. The function will take the salesperson name as a parameter and return back a string. We will perform a lookup using the range.find method. For that, we need to identify the search range, which is column A. The range.find method returns the matching cell as a range value. Let's create a range variable to hold that value. And now we can write out the search logic. We'll use the find method, move to a different line. And what are we searching for? We're searching for the salesperson. And when we find it, we'll take the value that is one column to the right. So we'll use the offset method, stay in the same row, move one column to the right. And let's return the value of the cell back to the function. So if a match is found, then all good. But if a match is not found, then this range variable has not been initialized yet, and this statement will throw an error. So what we need to do is evaluate this condition only if the range is not nothing. And if the range is empty, we can just return a blank string. Okay, that's done. Let's add this function back to our parent loop. We'll store the value of the email ID in our email ID variable. And remember to pass in the salesperson value. Okay, so we ran the macro for the first iteration. Let's hover over the email ID variable and we can see the value of the first email being stored in the variable. So that seems to be working. All that's left now is to send out the email. This is the final part of the outbound macro. Here, we'll send out an email to each salesperson along with the customized Excel file as an attachment. Let's build this logic out. So let's create a new module, create a new sub. This sub will take two parameters, the email ID that we grabbed in the previous module and the file name for the attachment. So at the moment, the file name doesn't contain the extension. So let's add that in. And now we can send the email. We'll do this via late binding. First, we'll connect to the Outlook app. Next, we'll create the email object. So we'll use the create item method of the instance of the Outlook application that we have just created up here. Creating an email is option 0. Okay, let's fill out the email properties, add the recipient's name, which is the email address that we are passing through the sub. No CC, no PCC. Let's add a subject line and let's add a generic body. So we'll just add 3 lines. This break tab moves to a new line in the Outlook email and regards. Now let's add the attachment. What are we adding? We're adding the file name here. And let's send the email. So if you're testing out macros, I would recommend commenting out the send method and using display instead. And that's what we will do. Okay. Let's call this sub from our parent macro. So we're passing in the email ID that we got above out here and the file name that we've already defined up here. Our outbound macro is now complete. Let's test this out in the next module. Wow, we are almost at the halfway mark. All that remains for the outbound macro is to do a full test run. Let's do that now. Let's run this macro. And remember, we're going to display our messages and not send them. Hit the play button. Great. 3 emails have been created, one for each salesperson. Let's open one attachment. The file looks correct. And that's our outbound macro. So now we have sent out the invoice reports to each salesperson. Let's imagine that they will review the invoices, fill out the comments, and email the file back to us. In the next module, we'll start building the inbound macro to compile the responses together. So we expect the salespersons to fill out the comments and send us the file. Let's refresh our memories with the steps again. We need to extract each file from the email. Then we'll collect all the data that was sent back in one Excel sheet. And lastly, we'll reconcile this data back to our main data set. We will build a parent inbound macro and 3 sub macros, one for each of these steps. Let's get started. Create a new module and a new sub and add in the code to stop the screen from fluttering and stop displaying Excel alerts. We will compile our responses back into the Responses worksheet. So let's clear out the contents of this sheet. And now we're ready to build our child macros. In this section, we'll build the logic to extract attachments from saved Outlook messages. Let's assume that each of our salesperson have sent back their Excel reports with all the data filled out. Let's go to Outlook and see how it looks. We have 3 emails here. Let's open up a file. And we have the fixed comments filled out in column G and some free text in column H. Now, as I had mentioned in the start, my preference is to not interact with Outlook directly whenever it can be avoided. So, we'll simply copy and paste these Outlook messages onto our computer. Let's create the folder first. So this will be our input folder, and we need 2 more folders here. The email folder will contain the Outlook messages, and the files folder will contain the extracted Excel files. Okay, let's do our copy and paste. So pasting our Outlook messages into the folder is really straightforward. Just going to select all the messages, copy, come to the email folder and paste. And one more thing, let's copy this file path and add it as a public constant. Okay, back to our parent macro. We are going to build a macro to loop over each saved Outlook message and extract each attachment out into the files folder. Let's create a new module. And a sub. We will interact with the folders using the file systems object library. So let's first create an object that references the file system object. Use the create object function. And now using this FSO object, we can create a new object that references the email folder. And let's pass in the folder path where our emails are saved. So that's the input folder constant, and it's in the email subfolder inside it. We also need to interact with the email attachment. So for this, we will need to create an object to reference the Outlook application. We'll use the same create object function, but this time we need to reference the Outlook application. And let's declare some more variables. We'll address them when we use them. Now let's begin looping over the Outlook files that are saved in our local folder. So for each file within the files in our email folder, let's just align this. Let's create an email object from the saved Outlook messages. This will allow us to programmatically interact with the saved emails and extract out the attachments. So we have already reserved a variable for this, and we'll use the OAP object to create an item from template, and we need to supply the file path, which is the path of the current file that we're iterating over. Okay, now we have connected to the email message. So let's grab the attachment. We ourselves know that there is only one attachment, but we'll work under the possibility that there are multiple attachments and we'll be extracting each one of them. So let's loop over each attachment. So we're going to create a nested loop. First, we'll grab the attachment name and we need to save it in the files folder. So let's add the full folder path in front of this file name. Our folder path is basically files, a backslash, and our attachment name. So now that we have the full name, we can go ahead and save this file on a folder. That's it for the inner for loop. And since we're going to reuse this OMail object in each iteration of the loop, we need to discard the object. Okay, that's it. And now let's call this sub from the parent sub. And let's align this. Okay, let's save and run the macro. So just to recap, what we're expecting is that each attachment from each of these files is going to be extracted and placed into the files folder. Okay, let's play the macro. Go to the files folder and we can see our 3 files. Great, so that's working well. Moving on to compiling the data together. So far, we have placed all the Excel files filled out with responses into a separate folder. Now in this section, we will loop over each Excel file, copy the data and paste it into our macro file within the response worksheet. There are a few things to watch out for, so let's build it out. Let's create a new module and a new sub. We will loop over each Excel file using the dir function. The dir function returns the first file name that's contained in the file path. Let's hold that file name in a variable and assign it to the output of the dir function. So where are we looking? We are looking in the input folder and within the files subfolder. And what are we looking for? We are looking for any file with the extension XLSX. Let's declare variables for the last row and workbook. We will use these in the loop that we are about to construct. We will need a variable to identify that we are on the first file found within the path. Let's declare it. We will set this variable initially to 0. And once we loop over the first file, we will change the value of this variable to 1. Okay, let's do a do while loop. So we will loop as long as a match is found, which means that as long as the file name variable is not empty. And to move on to the next file, we need to simply call the dir function again, and it will return the next file name. Okay, let's perform our actions. First, let's open the first Excel file. We again need to provide the full path because the file name does not contain the folder path. So once we've opened the workbook, the data in the sheet will be locked. Let's unlock it by unlocking the sheet. While locking the sheet, we use the protect method. While unlocking, we will use the unprotect method. And we need to provide the password that we had assigned, and we can go to the create file macro. I think this is where we saved our password. Yep, right there. And paste it in. And if the sheet has a filter on it because we had left the auto filter on, in that case, we'll need to remove the filters. Now, we need to copy the data into the response worksheet. Let's have a look at the response worksheet. It's blank at the moment. If we are on the first file, we will need to copy the data along with the headers. And if we are not on the first file, then we will copy just the data. So the first file means if file count is 0. So for the first file, we'll copy the entire data, which is the current region of cell A1. And once we've copied the data over, we can set the file count variable to 1. Okay, let's move on to the else condition. Suppose we are on the second file. So now we want to copy the data minus the top header row. So we will select the current region minus the top row and resize the range accordingly. So the next piece of code is slightly complicated. I have actually done 2 videos just on this topic. So please check them out if you are interested. So what we're going to do is first identify the current region and offset it by 1 row. That is, we move 1 row down, which means that the header row is no longer in our range. However, our range selection contains 1 extra row at the bottom, and we need to take out that extra row by resizing the range to equal to the total rows of the current range minus 1. So we need to grab the total rows in the current region and subtract it by 1. Dot copy. And where are we copying it to? We are copying it onto the response worksheet within column A, but this time we need to paste the data into the next available row. As of now, we've not defined the next available row. I'm just going to put in the variable name, and let's come out of the if statement and define the next available row. So the next available row is the total number of rows in the current region of cell A1 in the response worksheet plus 1. So it's not the last row, it's the next available row. So plus 1. All right. We need to close the workbook, but first let's relock the workbook. So I'm just going to copy this code. This time we are protecting, and we need to allow for the filtering. And we need to close the workbook. And since we're going to reuse this WB variable, we need to discard it before we move on to the next loop. Oof, that was quite a bit. Okay, that is done now. So let's copy and call this sub from our main macro. Let's run our macro. So remember, we ran both our macros, which means that the files have now been extracted, and we need to go to the responses worksheet, and we can see that all the data has been extracted and pasted into our worksheet here. Let's quickly make sure that all the data has indeed come in and we have not skipped any rows. And the way to check that is we have a total of 18 rows out here, including the header. And since this was generated from our main data set, it needs to equal the number of rows in the main data set, which is 18, and that's correct. Okay, in the next section, we'll reconcile these responses back to our main data set. All right, our original data set is the source from which all the files were created. Now that we have received all the files, it's time to merge the responses back to our original file. Before we finish the last piece of code, let's take a minute to understand why we are performing this step. In the previous section, we have already collected all the responses into the response worksheet. Then what's the point of merging this data back into our original data set? One clear benefit of merging the responses is to identify who hasn't sent us their files back or which salesperson has incompletely filled out the reports. You could even send those salespersons a reminder to complete and send their files back to us. Okay, let's move on to coding this final step. All we're going to do is look up this invoice number from our response data against the invoice number in the original data set. And if a match is found, we'll add the two comments to the original data set. Let's come back to our VB editor, create a new module, create a new sub. We are going to loop over the original data set. Let's define an iteration variable and a last row variable. We are going to use the find function to search for matches on the invoice number. So we need to define our search range, and our search range will be, so we're checking the invoice number from data versus the invoice number in the response worksheet. So our search range will be the column B in the response worksheet. And the returned value will be a range as well. And let's define a string variable to hold the invoice number. And we need to add in our column headers in column G and H in the data worksheet. So the header in cell G1 in the data worksheet will equal to a header in cell G1 in the response worksheet. And we can do the same for cell H. Actually, we should just do this in one go. Let's move on. Now we can create our for loop. So just to recap, we're going to loop over this data set And for each invoice number in the data worksheet, we are going to find a matching invoice number in column B in the response worksheet. And for a match found, we will grab the cell values from column G and column H within the same row. Let's grab the invoice number from the current cell in the data worksheet. And we will search for this invoice number in a search range. So we need to set the response range equal to the value returned by the find function. Okay, what are we searching for? We are searching for the invoice number. And if a result is found, or rather if the range response variable is not nothing, then the value that will go into the current cell in column G will be the value that is corresponding to the match cell, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns to the right. So we will need to do an offset. We stay in the same row, but we move 5 columns and we grab the value. Similarly, the value in H will be the corresponding value offset by 6 columns. And since this is in a loop, we need to empty out our response variable. Okay, that's it. And the very last thing left to do is call this macro from our parent sub. So we're going to do a full run. So let's just do a recap. Our saved Outlook attachments are in the email subfolder. We are going to extract the attachments and place them in the files subfolder. Once the files are extracted, we're going to take the data from each of those files and place them in the response worksheet. Once the data has been pasted in, we will grab the responses from column G and H and reconcile them back to the correct invoice number in the main data set. Okay, let's run our macro. That is done running. Our files are extracted. The responses have been compiled and come to our data worksheet. And we have the right response reconciled back to the right invoice number. Let's just make sure that is correct. 15334, contacted customer and no remarks. 15334, action contacted customer, will pay and no remarks. Okay, that looks correct. And that is the project. And let's wrap the session up. And that's it for this project. I hope you enjoyed this end-to-end flow. If you found it useful, please do consider liking and subscribing. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.